Hey, welcome back to the Métropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. We've just received a new standard ban list. This is the May 2024, the 2405 ban list that just dropped last morning. And this ban list adds 4 new cards to the standard ban list. We have this article that came up on nullsignal.game's website, link in the description, where Iain goes through these 4 cards and explains why these cards were banned and the ideas, the thinkings behind why these probably should not be allowed in the standard format. For the uninitiated, Null Signal Games does a lot of effort to curate the standard format, and currently that is done through just a ban list. There's a series of cards that are not allowed to be played. That's it. It's as simple as that. Now, the standard format, again, for the unfamiliar, that is the format that's probably the biggest Netrunner organized play format. It encompasses the last 7 years of cards. That includes an entirety of the Null Signal Games card catalog and the last couple years of Fantasy Flight Games products. Now, FFG products are obviously hard to find. They haven't been in print for a long time, but just keep in mind, if you want to get involved in organized play, proxies are allowed at all levels of events. And standard is really important because it is the format in which the World Championship in October is held in, let alone the upcoming Continental season that starts in just 2 weeks. It is probably the biggest Netrunner format, of course, outside of casual tabletop, a kitchen table play. Now, if you want to find more about the ban list entirely is listed at the bottom of this article. But of course, if you go to Netrunner DB and you go down to the More tab and you hit the ban list, it'll show you the entire ban list for the standard format. Just watch out. This is the 2403 ban list, so the update hasn't happened yet on Netrunner DB. For what it's worth, the new ban list is not technically competitively legal for at least 2 weeks. And very importantly, while you're not required to memorize all these cards, if you are building decks on Netrunner DB and you select the appropriate ban list, those cards that are banned just won't show up in the deck builder, let alone Netrunner DB will warn you if you're trying to build an illegal deck for the current ban list. So you don't have to remember all this stuff. Just go to Netrunner DB, sign in, and you can set it in your account that you should be building for the upcoming ban list. Now, this should be a quick enough video. We're going to go through the 4 cards that have been added to the ban list, explain what they've done, why they ended up banned, and what we think this is going to impact the competitive standard meta for the upcoming future. Now, the link for this article is in the description. I highly recommend checking it out. NSG does a great job explaining their reasoning behind the bans. And before we dive in, if you want to take a second just to like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, hit the notify button. There's a lot of things you can do to help the Métropole Grid. Definitely appreciated. Now let's start here. Our first banned card is a massive banned card. This is the NBN Agenda Bellona. This 5/3 agenda, mind you, came out in the end of 2019. Notably, this card art you see here is from the remastered edition, which dropped in 2024. So that timestamp at the bottom is technically not exactly accurate. I wish Netrunner DB could tell you when the cards came out. But Bellona has been the NBN agenda for the last 4.5 years since it came out. This whopping 5/3 agenda both has defensive and tempo positive text. When you score it out as the corporation, you gain 5 credits. But when the runner wants to steal this as an additional cost, they must pay 5 credits to steal it. And this card has just been a 3 of in every NBN deck for the last 4.5 years. There's so much going on here. Having a good 5/3 agenda is one of the most important things for your faction to give you some sort of flexibility with deck building, because 5/3 agendas are really good when they are really good. Firstly, in Netrunner, you need to have a certain modicum of points in your deck based on your deck size, usually somewhere between 18 and 20 points. And so the fact that you can put 3 Bellonas in your deck, that takes up 9 of your allocated points, that's only 3 card slots. Compare that if you wanted to make that same sort of thing with 2 pointers, that would take 5 card slots of agendas. So inherently having access to Bellonas means that you're having less deck slots to put into agendas, which gives you flexibility with deck building. Secondly, the text on this card is just buck wild. Having a tempo positive agenda that you score this out and it's a soft econ card, that's super, super valuable. But now understanding that for the last 4.5 years, nearly half the agenda points in any given NBN deck was gated behind 15 credits worth of stealing is kind of wild. And there's a lot of ways where that adds up. NBN is really good at getting that financial pressure and forcing your money out of your pockets in many different angles. So having this many points, again, half of the agendas in your deck being gated behind a very strict credit check is a massive thing for NBN to have just a very playable, defensive, yet tempo positive agenda. Now, another thing that interacts with Bellona in a very favorable way is Oppo Research. This is the quintessential tag me card right now in the standard format, and as long as a runner has stolen an agenda or trashed a card on their prior turn, you can spend 2 credits or sometimes 0 credits if you're playing Reality Plus to give the runner 2 tags. Now, Threat 3 is a new mechanic that showed up in the last cycle, a pretty exciting mechanic, and that Threat 3 text will only be active if at least one player has at least 3 points in one of their score areas. If that's the case, this Oppo now, instead of giving 2 tags, gives 4 tags, as much as you now have to pay an extra 5 credits. So you're generally paying 7 or 5 in Reality Plus to give the runner 4 tags. Now, Threat 3 is a really easy thing to hit in context of Bellona. Because if the corporation just install advances of Bellona on the table, That means next turn we're very likely going to be on threat 3. Either the corporation scores out of Bellona for functionally free, getting their 5 advancements refunded, or if the runner steals it, they have to pay 5 credits then and there. And then, of course, we're immediately on threat 3, and next turn, enjoy 4 more tags. They have to spend 8 more credits and your entire turn clearing. It's an immense financial cost. That's a really important thing to understand is now without Bellona in the format, it's not that easy to put an agenda on the table that's going to accelerate you to that Oppo threat 3 threshold. And so there's going to be a lot of games where you're not on threat 3 as soon as you can be in certain games where the NBN deck is just saying Bellona's on the table. What you going to do with it? So obviously losing a good agenda, but also losing an enabler for Oppo research is going to be a really big thing. And it all comes down to money. Again, I think we said this earlier, but these are the sort of decks right now that are doing really well for NBN. We streamed recently the Fly to EMEA tournament, link in the description. This is the winning deck. And it's an NBN Reality Plus deck with, of course, a full suite of Bellonas and 23 assets, and of course, those Oppo researches and some very powerful tag punishment. This deck has a lot of must-trash assets on the table. If you spend your money trashing this stuff and then clearing the tags of the Oppo, you obviously have less money. And then inherently, if the runner just doesn't have such a strong economy, they cannot keep up with this. And then again, 9 out of the 20 points in this deck, you just cannot interact with. And so now we're going to have to see NBN decks that are a bit stronger to central pressure, that are a bit weaker when the runner is gassed out. So just getting the runner to this area where they have to click for credits and barely are able to interact is not inherently going to be a win condition without more steps and taking on more risk. And that's kind of fascinating for these NBN decks. And just to hammer this home, how important this is probably the most important card that's now been banned out for the format because it doesn't just hit one archetype of 25 asset NBN decks. This hits every NBN deck I think we've known for the last, again, 4.5 years. Just to show you what modern NBN decks look like, here's a bunch of different archetypes, and you'll notice one key commonality: 3 Bellonas. This is Hollow Ops, Man of the Moon's NPC Vancouver winning deck, 3 Bellona. It's a tempo-based Reality Plus deck. Table Carnage, Second of Worlds, is a horizontal NBN trap deck with a kill combo, of course, 3 Bellonas. Let's keep going. This is the more European style asset-based Reality Plus deck, 3 Bellonas. We're playing full, only 6 agendas, half of them Bellonas, NBN Glacier deck, 3 Bellonas. 3 Bellonas. This is the re-education sort of combo decks that like to have a defensive agenda, whether it's Jupestat or Neurospike, 3 Bellonas. And then even when we get to the more interesting and wild stuff, a more modern king-making superconducting hub, it wants to lean on the fact that it can have this agenda base of 3 Bellonas, which helps a heck of a lot on many different angles. Again, just to hammer this home, when we search tomorrow's headline in the deck searcher, this is 30 of the last most popular NBN decks. And out of all of these decks, 2 of them are startup decks. Startup doesn't have Bellona right now. Out of all of these, there's only 1 deck that doesn't have Bellona in it. When I'm saying that Bellona is the most popular NBN agenda, it's not even close. And losing that is going to have a huge impact on the format for sure. Notably, the one deck that doesn't play Bellona that's still on this list, this is an older deck. It's from a year ago. It was a really fascinating deck. We played it on stream. Hopefully, if you want to watch some gameplay, there should be a time box above my head. But this deck is running as many small agendas and then scoring them out quickly, all in the same turn with things like Sands, City Grid, and Arella. This is actually interesting for something to keep in mind, is that without Bellona, there's a chance we're going to be playing more smaller agendas kind of by design. And that means these sort of fast advanced decks, a sort of like NBN decks circa 2014, might come back into vogue, which is kind of interesting as much as obviously might be less powerful without Bellona. Now, clearly this seems like a huge hit to NBN, and obviously it is. And NSG recognizes that. This is going to be a huge jump down in power for the entire faction. But very specifically, a new card, or one of the recent cards, Hollowman, is called out as hopefully being a stopgap solution until the next sets comes out that should hopefully get some more power back into NBN. Hollowman's a very powerful card that came out of the last set and is doing a lot of work for NBN, let alone most other factions, and this card allows you to score out agendas and weird scoring patterns at aggressive rates. And I'd argue that Hollowman is going to make most NBN decks better as a whole. Now, what I'm a bit cautious about is one of the best ways to use Hollowman in NBN was actually to score out your Bellonas, because inherently Hollowman is pretty expensive. You're spending 8 credits to score out a Bellona, which you can never advance on the table, which is a pretty powerful line, but then you got your 5 credits back. And now the Hollowman on the table, the runner still has to trash and respect because clearly you can score another agenda because you did get a fair bit of money back. Hollowman is a very expensive card. And while there's a chance that without Bellona, we're going to be leaning on Hollowman more to score more 4-2s and 3-2s and do some fast advance stuff, I do think Bellona was a natural combination with Hollowman. And losing both of those might actually make Hollowman seem a bit worse in NBN than in some other factions, potentially. It's still Hollowman, it'll still be good, but now it's actually quite expensive if you're not importing things like Off-World Office to make some money off of it. So now the question still stands, how do you build an NBN agenda suite? And honestly, I don't have a strong answer. NBN notably still has access to 2 3-point agendas. We have Degree Mill, which is a defensive 3-point agenda, at least on some board states. If you win the game, the text doesn't really matter as long as you have installables. And I have played Netrunner competitively where Degree Mill was an agenda that was getting played. So whether we just swapped in 3 copies of Degree Mill, I'd be really surprised. I think we're more likely to see NBN decks that have only 2 3-pointers in them and more 2-pointers that they want to score on tempo. The other option, of course, is Re-Education, which is a bit more of a comboed card. And now those decks did get fair worse losing the Bellonas because those are the agendas they played. But there's a chance that we're going to see more 2-pointers and even some of the weird 1-pointers that seem good on tempo, but just didn't see slots in decks like Post-Truth Dividend right there above my head. So it's not an easy thing to swap. Again, if we're playing more 4-2s, at least with the last set, we got some interesting 4-2s that could take that spot. Stoke the Embers is a pretty cool card, as much as it only really feels like Epiphany support right now until we see some cool combo decks. And then, of course, I think Kingmaking is actually probably worth looking into. Now, Kingmaking is a 4-2 agenda, but if you score it and its ability fires, it is functionally a 4-3 agenda. And having a 3-point agenda is actually really important in most decks. This is something that makes Bellona very powerful. As a corp, you generally have to score to 7 points. Which means having an odd number on one of your agendas is important, because as long as you've scored 1 Bellona, you generally win the game by scoring 3 agendas. As soon as you have a deck of only 4-2s, you need to score out 4 agendas. That can be difficult. Admittedly, equally, the runner has to steal 4 agendas, so that can be good for you. But having a 3-pointer in your deck, as much as you could do Project Beal and make it a 3-pointer, so Kingmaking does seem a bit interesting, as much as running extra 1-pointers and not having Bellona means your agenda density is going to get a bit bulky. This is a wild change. It really is. It's going to be a hard thing, and I imagine that NBN is going to be not seen competitively for a bit until creative deck builders find a way to address with this, because this just wipes out almost every NBN competitive archetype the way we've seen it for the last 4.5 years. It's notable, this came up in the article too, but Obokata Protocol, the banning of Obokata Protocol is the closest thing we've seen to the current banning of Bellona. Obokata Protocol was very equally like Bellona. When he started building a Jinteki deck about a year and a half ago, you started by putting 9 points of Obokata, an incredibly defensive agenda. And once Obokata Protocol got banned, basically Jinteki as a faction almost got banned competitively. And what's really cool is that now we're seeing a bit more Jinteki. There's been, more cards printed for sure. And we're seeing other agendas explored, which is cool. We didn't play bacterial programming back in the day. It was a bit more kind of maligned. But now without Obokata, this agenda, what turns out is actually kind of sick. So there's a chance that intrepid deck builders are going to find some sort of exploration space that now not having Bellona forces you into those depths, and you might come up with something that is, interesting and surprising. But I think there's no way around it. The banning of Bellona is going to be such a massive hit for NBN decks. Overall, honestly, I'm not too upset about it. NBN as a faction has been consistently competitively, year after year after year after year. Oppo is just kind of a grind to play into, and the 25 acid R+ decks are kind of miserable, at least on a casual level. So I'm glad that stuff doesn't exist. And if the agenda suite is a bit more assailable for average Netrunner play, that's probably better, that you're not spending more time in their prison where you don't have 5 credits to steal or 10 credits to steal the 6 points you need to close the game out. So overall, actually quite positive about this, but I am interested to see whether NBN can hold its head above any amount of water over the next couple of weeks of Continental season and NAN PC events. It's going to be interesting. Next up, our only runner ban of the set. This is Knobkierie. This is a fascinating card. It's one of the old FFG cards. It's a console. It's unique, costs 5 credits, and it gives you 3 MU, which is pretty wild for a console, as much as that MU can only be used for virus programs. Its ability is incredibly strong. It says the first time a turn you make a successful run, you can put a virus counter on one of your installed viruses. Now, this is the virus console in the standard format, and there's basically 1.5 archetypes with this ban is entirely targeting. It is not the most universally played console. It is obviously just in a single archetype, but that archetype has been incredibly powerful. And hopefully banning Knobkierie gives you a bit more tools to play around that archetype, because it is inherently very hard to play around Knobkierie. So what do virus decks do in the standard format? They put down viruses and get unending value from the barrage of Knobkierie. So for instance, Imp. Imp is such an important card in these decks. It is a cornerstone card, but Imp has only a certain amount of charges. Once you use the 2 virus counters across 2 turns, that's it. The Imp is empty. While you can flicker it in and out with things like Simulchip, the biggest idea is that once you get your Knobkierie down, you have that infinite Imp, the Infinite. And you just cannot purge out the Imp, because there is no window in the game. Once the successful run is made, the counter goes on the Imp, and the Imp will be definitely trashing something this turn. There's just no way to deal with it. As long as the runner can make a successful run, which they need to for the Imp will always have a charge once per turn. And that is just a sort of siege engine that a lot of tier 2, tier 3 decks cannot stand up against the good virus decks. because while they sometimes lack multi-axis, they excel in saying every turn I'm trashing something and I'm going to wear you down. It's a very hard thing to fight without the proper tech in the deck. It's really, really rough. The next card with this is Audrey. Mind you, Audrey just came out in Automata Initiative just last year, and it's been a really exciting AI icebreaker, and it needs you to trash things. And while you can use Knobkierie just to charge the Audrey, this is one of the cornerstone breakers in a lot of these decks. The idea is that as long as you can charge the Imp just charges the Audrey, and you actually have a pretty efficient, honestly free to break, if not making credits, running and trashing stuff and just keeping yourself pushing forward. There's largely two archetypes you see this deck in. The first is the Mulch archetype. Shout out to Tuno, who wrote the NSG article from the SBL team. This is Tuno's list that won the CBI, a totally stacked event. We first saw this archetype at Worlds, and then we saw it refined over the next couple months, but this deck is totally wild. It has recursion, it has all the viruses, and the late game with the Knobkierie, it is an absolute nightmare to deal with. I think more commonly, modernly, we've seen more people play this in the sort of like always open Imp Lu archetypes, and Lu just gets a bit more value from trashing and has a bit of a thinner deck. Now, this deck fundamentally plays in a very similar way. You get the Knobkierie down, you have your recursion, you have your Imps, and you just constantly siege the opponent down while having Audrey as your breaker. Now, I think you can argue which version you like better, whether the Lu or the Hoshiko version, but I don't think it's doubtable that a good pilot at the helm of either of these decks, this is clearly a tier 1 deck in the format and probably needs some amount of addressing. And I actually like the Knobkierie addressing because currently, if you ask me in the standard format, it is hard to deal with viruses. The base action you have as a corporation is you can spend 3 clicks on your turn to purge viruses. And I would argue that that does not keep up with the speed of the game. Specifically when it comes to Knobkierie, sure, you purge out the viruses, but as soon as they make a successful run, the virus engine starts ticking back up. And you cannot purge things like Simulchip, because if they want to produce a virus at instant speed on their turn or on your turn, they can do it, and you cannot purge that. Cards like Botulus, they're always going to get their virus counters. Cards like Cookbook, they're going to come in with more virus counters. Spending your whole turn to purge is nearly impossible at the speed that some of these decks can set up and start hammering you. On that note, you should play Hammer. Now, one of the cards that does show up pretty consistently to address these sort of decks is Mavirus, and this is a card that has shown up to be immensely popular over the last year. Feels like it's dying down a bit, but this is one of the only like 1 and 2.5 cards in the standard format that interact positively with viruses that you have access to, and this is the one that's the most playable. And we're kind of in a spot on the competitive format that if you're not playing Mavirus, you need a really good reason not to be playing it, because it's the only avenue you have to interact on the runner's turn with these sort of engines. Like, it doesn't even interact with Knobkierie, but allows you to purge without spending your whole dang turn on it, which is kind of really important. I think the game doesn't want to be in a spot where if you're not playing Mavirus, you just get rolled by these decks, as much as some of the ice can make that matchup a bit more difficult. But we're in a spot where it's hard to address Knobkierie, and these decks need to be slowed down a bit. And I think knocking the Knobkierie out of them is a very targeted thing that's not going to hit Anarch as a whole, which, for better or for worse, we'll figure out if that's the thing that we need to do, but we'll keep these decks a bit more in check. And it's actually a hard problem to fix. Like, I'm not sure what the deck does to fix the Knobkierie problem, because Knobkierie is really, really important in the deck for a couple reasons. Firstly, you lose your console slot, and not only does having 3 MU, that's a huge help for the virus package that wants to run a lot of these incidental viruses, but you lose that virus ability. So now in the standard format, there's no console currently that interacts with viruses in any positive way. I'm not sure if we're playing Demolisher, the 1 MU might be, that's a cool ability, but the 1 MU might be close. We're seeing much more patchwork in some of the Hoshiko decks that are not exactly virus pilled, but maybe we're playing Maw for a bit more disruption on a different angle. It's just because there's no MU cards in Anarch, there's nothing that works with viruses inherently, it's hard to address the MU problems that Knobkierie solves. Because cards like Audrey do take up 2 MU, so you do get bogged down sooner than later. I think one card that's probably going to see a fair bit more play now is Friday Chip. Friday Chip is kind of like Knobkierie, but it requires you to have additional steps, but gives you the flexibility to move that virus at the start of your turn as long as you trash stuff. But the big thing about Friday Chip is that when your turn starts as a corporation, you can purge. And not only will that purge the viruses on the table, but it will purge the Friday Chip. So at least to get that first virus counter to start up the Audrey, you're going to have to expend some sort of Simulchips or recursion or flicker effect like a rejig onto a cookbook. Like, you're gonna have to work a bit harder for it, which I think overall is good, because as a corporation, it feels like purging might be a bit more impactful using the basic action when Knobkierie is not going to just bring everything back. So overall, kind of cool, because it felt like purging currently in the standard format doesn't make sense. If you're not playing Mavirus, that matchup is kind of miserable, and that deck is clearly very powerful, so maybe it takes down 1 peg. I do want to shout out the fact that, like, we did just say that NBN's in a really rough state, potentially with losing Bellona. Losing Knobkierie is actually an upside for a bunch of those decks. We've seen decks like this, mind you, this came in second at Worlds. This sort of horizontal damage-based trap deck kind of can get eaten alive by some of these like Imp turn after turn decks. And part of it is, yeah, you can trash some of those assets cheaply, that helps. But a bigger part of the pressure is that you can trash some of the operations from hand. You don't get oppo researched if you can just constantly threaten to imp the oppo research, let alone the deck's win conditions attached to a single copy of End the Line. If that's in the bin, there's a lot more work the corporation has to do. For what it's worth, while the NBN horizontal decks definitely got hit by losing Bellona, if there's less of these Lu decks and less of these Hoshiko Mulch decks, that matchup actually gets a bit easier. So we'll see how it balances out. I think you'd rather have Bellona than not have Lu, but yeah, that's definitely going to be an interesting thing that makes this conversation a bit more nuanced. All right, next up, Reconstruction Contract. This is our last FFG card to hit the ban block. This is Reconstruction Contract, also called Rococo, as I will call it. It's a weird asset, because this card is banned not so much because of its power level, but more so because of some weird rule stuff that are both unintuitive and paves the way for NSG to make some rules changes in a way that they've been intending to do for the last little while. So what does Rococo do? It's a bit of a nuanced card. The top text almost doesn't matter. It's a really strange card because the way that it plays out in competitive standard play is not the way that it's intuitive from a distance. Firstly, it says whenever the runner suffers any amount of meat damage, you may place an advancement token on Reconstruction Contract. That is an ability that fires in a niche subcase of decks. We'll show that, but a lot of decks are playing Rococo without caring about that text at all. It's the bottom text that's more important. At instant speed in any paid ability window, you can trash Rococo to move any number of advancement tokens from the Rococo to any other card that can be advanced. So as long as you can get advancements on Rococo, you can use this as a fast advanced battery, and you just move the tokens from this to something else. And back in 2019, Pincel used this in an HB Acer Group deck to win a world championship. And this combo was pretty well known back in the day, but you had Dedication Ceremony, which allowed you to spend a click to put 3 advancements on a card. You could put those on a card that can't be advanced, which very importantly, Rococo can't be advanced. You can't take the basic action to advance it. And then we would just move that to the Rococo and start scoring agendas from hand and fielding recursion and other fast advance stuff. A pretty neat deck, but this deck doesn't exist anymore for a couple reasons, mostly rotation, but that was the big way that Dedication Rococo was played. Now, more modernly, in this deck also, mind you, Tuno, again, from the SBL team, won the CBI with this on the corp side. This is a bit of a damage attrition deck that's setting up some weird forks, and it's actually using both parts of the Rococo, but it's another sort of deck that probably doesn't exist anymore without Rococo, let alone since then Formicary got banned, and that's kind of outside the discussion of this video. But most notably, the reason why this card got banned is because of strange op combo decks. This deck has definitely been a known quantity since the last set came out, and specifically with Hollowman coming out, this is a bit more consistent, it seems, but it's a sort of deck that people were afraid of and nobody really brought to tournaments over the last couple of months until Terrence brought it and won the NPC event in Toronto. Nobody listened to me. Now we have to listen, or in fact, not listen at all because the card is banned. So the idea with this deck, it's a bit nuanced. We're going to dive into the weeds just to understand how this worked and why this had to be banned out. Op is such a cool identity. It's a Wayland identity that says once per turn when you trash one of your cards through one of your abilities, you can search and res a card from your deck that cost 1 less than the card you trashed, and you res it for free, not paying any credit costs. So if you trash a 3-coster, you go get a 2-coster from your deck if you want to. Flexible, powerful ability, and allows you to do some weird combo shenanigans in a lot of board states. So the idea is, as long as you can get advancements on your Reconstruction Contract, which takes you a bit of effort because you can't advance it yourself. That's why we're largely playing the Hollowman here, because Hollowman can advance any card. It doesn't have to be an advanceable card. But once we get some quantity of advancements on Reconstruction Contract, we're allowed to do a bit of a silly combo. Firstly, we can trash this. And if we trash this, we've trashed a 1-coster, so we can use Op to get a 0-coster at instant speed. So the idea is that if this is on the table and it has advancements on it, and the runner tries to run it, or let alone run any remote server, you can technically trash a Reconstruction Contract. Op will fire here, interrupt, and allow you to search for a 0-coster. And when the runner's about to breach another server, you ask, do you want to access? Once they've confirmed they're locked in, they can't jack out. That's your last paid ability window to trash this thing and go search your deck for something like an Urtica Cipher. That's a 0-cost card that we can get rezzed onto the table for free. Then the final part of Reconstruction Contract fires, which allows you to move any number of advancements from this, and then you move them to the Urtica Cipher, and the Urtica Cipher can do, say, 5 net damage and flatline an unsuspecting Netrunner. More damage, the more advancements you have, of course. And this entirely works. It's rules complete. It's kind of goofy because you trash the card to get something and then move the tokens over. It is how it is. But you might be wondering, how does that win the game? You just do the exact same combo with more advancements at the end of the runner's turn or at the start of your turn, and instead of getting an Urtica Cipher, you get a Clearinghouse. Then you fire the Clearinghouse that ideally has 6 tokens on it, and the runner just flatlines to meet damage. So you build this like sort of no-win situation in which either you have to deal with the Urtica sooner than later, or you die to the Clearinghouse, And it is assailable. The deck has largely competitively been seen to be a bit inconsistent and fiddly. I think the NSG folks from the SBL team said that. They're like, we're not worried about the power level of this deck, but more so the rules implications of how this works, and the idea of a no change in game state is a bigger reason why this needed to be targeted. It's not that this deck is winning many events, it's kind of strange and unintuitive, and specifically, NSIGs is a thing. NSIGs is a term you might have heard. It stands for no change in game state, and it's been this thing haunting Netrunner for a while now. It was largely established in the worlds of Fantasy Flight games, and it's something that still existed into this game before. And the rule says, and this is something that NSG has been working on for a while, the last update on this was during the Ashes Remaster rules update earlier in February, where basically NSG said they're working to remove this NSIGs. It's just a hard thing to remove. What NSIG says is that there's a rule that says that players cannot trigger an ability that won't do anything for a particular value of not do anything that looks only at the direct effects of an ability, not the cost paid to use it. This is a bit of a wordy sentence, but in short, what it means is that in Netrunner, you cannot do something if the effect of the thing you're doing does not change the game. Now, I'll show you an example. Reconstruction Contract is a great example, and this is a card that's always been a thorn in the side of NSIGs, because the idea is, are you allowed to trash a Reconstruction Contract if it has no tokens on it? And the answer in NSIGs is no. You cannot trash a Reconstruction Contract because trashing it has no capability of changing the game state. Now you might be saying, but of course I'm changing the game state. The Reconstruction Contract is going from the remote server into archives, let alone I'm firing op to get a zero coster. I'm clearly changing the game. But the way that NSIGs has classically been defined and currently is defined in the comprehensive rules is the ability to change the game state does not look at the cost to activate the effect. So the fact that we're not able to change the game state because we have no counters to move means we're not able to fire this. This might be unintuitive. You might not agree with it. And I agree with you, whatever you think. I do agree with you. And largely, NSG is doing a lot of effort to make this not the case. They want to abolish NSIG so you don't have to worry, does this actually change the game state before looking at the cost? What's a cost? What's an effect? You don't have to worry about that. But the problem is there are certain cards currently in Netrunner in which NSIGs are important and respecting NSIGs are important. And this, unfortunately, is one of the cards. Why does that matter? If there was no NSIGs rule and you could trash this whenever you want, regardless of counters, it means at any board state, at any paid ability window, if you had a Recoco on the table, you could trash it to go get a spin or a Rashida, right? If it has an ability to change the game state on all boards, you can just trash this to get zero costers at instant speed. That might not sound busted, but it clearly changes the power level of this and op. And in maybe a more maligned version, it means that at instant speed, you can grab snares. The runner can run any remote server and say, oh, here's a snare. And they just have to deal with that. Now, this card was balanced around NSIGs existing. The intention when this card was designed by FFG was that you could not trash it for no reason. And so, again, Reconstruction Contract is a thorn in the side. Another really weird thing about NSIGs is that to be able to trash this thing, you need to have a target on the table before op fires that is a legal target to receive the advancement tokens. It's another like road bump that's really awkward in this combo deck. The idea is that I cannot trash this unless there's not even a rezzed card, but any card on the table that can be advanced. So that means these decks are running a modicum of advanceable ice just to make sure they're on a board state where they can't not fire the Rococo because it doesn't technically have a target before op searches for a legal target. Again, it's an ugly artifact of NSIGs, and NSG wants to shut that down. The worst part about this is that if your ice walls on the table are unrezzed, you have to call a judge over to prove to the judge you have advanceable targets. It's not great. It's super, super inelegant. And the short of the long is Reconstruction Contract can't exist because NSG wants to destroy NSIGs and make it so that you don't have to worry about all this nonsense. They're actually on the way to do it. Now, they've done a lot already. The rules team has already ironed out a lot of NSIG stuff when it comes to playing operations and events. You'll see some of the stuff now that some events are reworded to actually have conditions that you can only play them so they don't have to worry about if the effect can change the board state or not. It's a bit complicated and outside the scope of this video, but Reconstruction Contract is gone. And that's pretty good because NSIGs is closer to not being a thing, so you don't have to worry about any of these complicated rule stuff. It's not so much the power level of Recoco as much as there are weird combo decks that can get you by surprise, but more so because rule stuff is weird and we don't need it to be this weird. Cool, I'm behind that. So how does that matter to the meta? Probably doesn't. You know, some people were playing extra copies of Flip Switch in their deck just so they had a way to jack out when that Urtica cipher was fed in front of them. I think you're still going to see some amount of Flip Switch in the standard meta just because it has relevance against like Hafrun Stavka and other mean ice stuff. So maybe you'll see less Flip Switch, but I think that's the only thing that matters here. Cool. We have one last card to talk about, and this one's a really interesting one too. This is Tributary. This card just came out 2 months ago. It is just in the last set, Rebellion Without Rehearsal, and admittedly a bit of citation needed here. It's a bit hard to do the legwork to prove this, but I'm pretty sure that this is the fastest a card has ever been banned after it's been released. This card was only legal for 2 months before it hit the ban block. It's a very fresh, shiny new card that a lot of people were excited to play with, and I think they learned very quickly that this thing is absolutely monstrous. Tributary. It's a 3-cost Jinteki Ice. It's technically unique, which means you can only have one rezzed at a time, but you can play multiple in your deck. A lot of people will do that. It's 4 strength, and it has 2 subroutines. The first says you may draw a card, you may install a piece of ice protecting another server free of cost. That's a very good subroutine. And then the second says each piece of ice for the rest of this run gets +2 strength. Now, the important thing for this is the text on the front, which says the first time each turn a run begins, you may move this to be the outermost on the server being ran. So the runner is going to be interacting with Tributary consistently. Basically once per turn, as long as you choose to move it, and more often than not, it is correct to move this. In rare cases, is it the wrong thing to move. Those subroutines, they don't maybe seem like you have to break these because they're like end the run subroutines or trash programs, but they are functionally in a lot of board states just so much value for the corporation that we end up in situations where running just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, on its own, just looking at some of the numbers, this card is a bit undercosted, even if it didn't move around. Now, you could argue this, and I think if this card didn't move around, it would probably see next to no play, but the fact that this thing cost a lot to break and not a lot to res is kind of noteworthy. It's hard to break this thing really well. It's very expensive to break for how little you spend to res it, and there's no way to slice that. It's just difficult to deal with. Let alone, of course, you'll be dealing with it consistently once it's rezzed. Once this card is rezzed, it does a lot to the whole game, because every single turn, the runner has to now play around this card. They have to mentally are taxed by the fact that their first run of turn is going to be challenged by this, and then they have to do a lot more math. Figuring out, is it better to burn a run running archives and let this fire before I charge the remote server? It slows down the game. It causes so much extra analysis for a very potentially interesting ability. But at the end of the day, this card costs 3 credits to res. The amount of damage that it does to the board state in terms of thoughts and play lines and what it hurts and what it challenges and the extra thinking that has to be done for 3 credits is just a ridiculous ratio, it turns out. This card is what I would call a snap res card. And there's still currently a bunch of cards in the standard format that are on the ban list because they were considered to be snap res cards. There are cards like this. Cards that the cost to res versus how much they cost to break versus how impactful they are on almost any board state are almost worth resing regardless of credit totals. It feels like if you can res Tributary, you should res Tributary 10 out of 10 times. Obviously, it's a bit of a reduction, but we're ending up in this spot where this card is just so powerful for the cost that it should be res on all board states if it can. And NSG has gone out the way to say that they don't want cards like that. But admittedly, the big reason why Tributary is banned is because it is just present on, once it's res, the whole game is kind of messed up. Now, on one hand, I think this is a cool card. It's interesting. There's decisions to be made. I like utility ice that doesn't just end the run or give credits. Like, those are cool. But of course, overall, all these effects stapled onto one cheap package proved to be too much. We're also seeing this splashed out of faction, which is kind of fascinating. I think in some ways that frustrates me because a lot of these decks will play one of Tributary. And the fact that this ASA group, which gets immense amount of value when Tributary fires, can get their Tributary rezzed early on turn 1 or turn 2, it kind of functionally feels like you're playing against, instead of one just ASA group ID, you're playing against 1.5 IDs. There's this ongoing text, and there's some ways to deal with Tributary. There's some parts of the card pool that make it a bit easier to manage, but it just changes the game so fundamentally on a 1 of per deck that I don't really love that design. And we're seeing Tributary everywhere. It's good in Jinteki decks, but also in HB, we're seeing in Wayland. In fact, we've even seen some HB decks that are going out the way to get Tucana, which is a great card, and just to make sure that you can consistently get Tributary on the table to start messing stuff up. It is an incredibly powerful effect for 3 credits, and it just slows the whole game down. I think what's the most notable thing, though, and this is what NSG was very clear about in this article, that they wanted to make an exception, because generally NSG wants to wait for a while. A powerful card comes out and people have feedback that this thing is pretty wild for its cost or whatever it does for the game, but NSG largely will wait longer than 2 months to see if the meta can kind of like react to it. Because sometimes powerful cards become less powerful once people realize play patterns or deck construction that can deal with it. Now, this is a different case because while this card is very powerful, what it seems to be doing in the modern meta right now to an entire faction is invalidating them. You hear this from some of the top players. Mind you, this is D's deck that they brought to Fight Club, and it is a criminal deck. It's a Los deck. That's notably not what you'd expect. And largely, D here writes, Tributary wrecks criminals. The general game plan for the criminal decks is to play is to get value from central accesses while building a board state. Tributary means that the value central run does not exist. And that's a really big deal here. Coming in second place at Worlds last year was a sort of Sable deck that wants to make these sort of runs, figure out what's the least defended server and capitalize on that. Run your mark, get credits, charge your bankrolls, do your leeches, your info bounties, whatever you want. That's inherently how we played run-based criminal for a long time now, and it's a really fun archetype. The idea is that you find the least ice server and you capitalize on it. And you can't do that. Tributary inherently ices all servers, and going through the Tributary or breaking the Tributary basically cancels out any of the sort of value you think you're scraping through by playing that sort of like, I'm going to punch holes in whatever I can criminal. And so criminal just hasn't existed competitively for the last 2 months. It just fell off of a cliff. And now the idea is that without Tributary, hopefully this stuff can come back. And that was the big reason why NSG was pretty heavy-handed on a 2-month window before something got banned, which is pretty notably strange, is because it was just knocking an entire faction off of competitive tables. And I can get behind that for sure. I think Tributary is interesting, obviously a bit too powerful. I think run-based criminal is good. Anybody who's trying to make, dirty laundry archives, oops, a Tributary, like, how much of a burden it is. And I think a lot of people are going to feel a fair bit better about that. Now, notably, what is this going to do to the meta? It's kind of interesting because Tributary actually had some really strong effects against other strong cards that we're still seeing play as much as Tributary was not uncommon, but also not like ubiquitous. Cards like Banhar. Banhar is a very strong Anarch card, but it's harder to play in a world where a Tributary gets rezzed. Because now the outermost ice that you're charging with Banhar can be a Tributary, unfortunately, unless you spend a click kind of, weaving that Tributary and pulling it into a different server. That is rough. And so now Banhar, as much as it still saw consistent play over the last 2 months, is even more consistent. And of course, Banhar is a very powerful card. The new card Alarm Clock in some ways was good into Tributary because you could spend that 0-click run forcing the Tributary on HQ and just like burning into it. You don't want to double click the Tributary often, but now Alarm Clock seems a bit more consistent where there's not always that outermost ice on HQ that's going to take the 2 clicks instead of double clicking through a big barrier or something like that. Also Kit. Kit sees a fair amount of competitive play right now, and Kit hates Tributary. Kit paints the outermost, the first encountered ice, to be a code gate, and that is always going to be Tributary. So now Kit can use the ability a bit more consistently, which is definitely going to be valuable. And the Kit decks right now are pretty good. Now in Jinteki, this is unfortunately the bummer here, is that it was a good Jinteki tool. And I think Jinteki needs a lot of support. I think we saw 2 Tributaries in most Ag and Fusion Glacier decks as a pretty good card in there. But right now, the Jinteki ice pool is a bit inconsistent, if you ask me. Now, Jinteki as a whole loves having some more ice because the Jinteki ice pool is pretty all over the place. This is all the ice currently in the standard format that costs 3 credits or fewer. And if you don't care about net damage, there's like 2 pieces of ice you really want to consider putting in your decks most often. That would be Tattoo Bola, of course, and Thimble Rig. The Tributary was a nice injection to the cheap mid-range ice for good stuff Jinteki. But yeah, it's obviously gone for the better of the game. But yeah, we're sliding further back when Jinteki gets the nice stuff they wanted. I think the biggest bummer is I was recently trying to record some Alphabet Series deck dives and I was getting stuck on Atea. And I said, I'm going to wait for the new ban list to hopefully make Atea feel a bit more powerful against some of the like breaker suites and some of the Knobkierie virus stuff too. Like that was a pretty rough matchup. And I did not have on my bingo sheet that Atea would actually get significantly worse with this ban list. So it's a bit of a bummer. I think it's the right move overall. I think Tributary is incredibly stifling, but we're just hoping in the near future with the new sets, the sort of like mid-range Jinteki can get a bit more ice to play with. Charlotte was a great step for sure. And that's it. Those are the 4 cards. I think this is actually a huge ban list for obvious reasons, right? We get some targeted stuff here with Knobkierie hitting a certain thing. We have a rules thing. Reconstruction Contract means we're one step closer to NSIGs. Tributary, I think that's just going to open criminal card pool. And then of course, Bellona might make NBN entirely unplayable. I think we'll find out in the near future, but overall, I'm okay with that. Fantastic article. Again, I would highly recommend to give it to read. Tuna goes through it and describes all its thoughts on why this stuff has to happen, what the testing is. I also want to give a huge shout out here. At the top of the article talks about how for the last 2.5 years, the head of the SBL team was Lost Geek. You might know Lost Geek. That is Ogus from Paolo's Cafe. Lost Geek did a fantastic job on the SBL team. It's one of the big reasons why Eternal is like as cool as the format it is now with the Eternal point system. So Lost Geek is stepping down. Thanks so much, Lost Geek, for all your work. It's definitely appreciated. Now that role is going to be taken over by Safer. You might know from the dev team. Shout out to Safer. Wishing you all the best from the role. It's definitely a difficult role. A lot of testing has to be going on. Shout out to the whole SBL team that does all the testing and data and all that sort of great stuff. Tuno, obviously, as well. And that's the ban list. It technically drops today. It's competitive legal in 2 weeks, so it'll be competitively legal for America Continentals, which starts, I believe, on the 1st of June. That's going to be a massive event. Again, if you're coming to NPC Providence, NPC Boston, as it's actually called, sort of, that is next week, and that will be respecting this ban list. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Of course, 4 cards banning out can make a huge change on the meta. I have no doubt we're going to see that. I would love to hear your thoughts. What you're excited about, what you're ruining, what you wish was changed. There's definitely a lot of other things I think people are expecting from this ban list. I have no doubt we're going to see as soon as Continental season wraps up. A lot of more structural things when it comes to icebreakers and stuff like that. It's a harder thing to nail down, but I think this seems like a good start, and I'm excited to see what this brings. Would love to hear your comments. If you want to take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, notify button, all that good stuff helps the channel a heck of a lot. And thanks so much for watching. Enjoy your new ban list, legal in 2 weeks. Enjoy some standard Netrunner. Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for watching. We made a bunch of predictions of what the ban list was going to look like on stream. We made a couple guesses. I think we nailed some of them. I think Rococo going was a safe bet. I think people didn't like the combo, let alone N6 has its own path to burn. I don't think I called Bellona. I thought Bellona would be too big of a hit and like the whole faction kind of falls apart. There's a chance it might. I'm honestly kind of excited to see it. If we see more different NBN agendas, I think that's great. I want to spend an extra 10 credits scoring 6 points. That's a lot of money in this economy. I think for Anarch, we called labor rights. I think Knobkierie makes sense, but it targets only specifically the virus decks, which I think are incredibly powerful. And I do struggle with purging to viruses. I don't think it makes sense. You might have heard in the video. So that still leaves it open whether we think something like Generalist Hoshiko in the near future needs a bit of a balance change. And again, we'll definitely going to see it in a couple months if it comes to it after the Continental season. We got a Hoshiko sweep last year. Can we get it this year? Tune in soon to find out. Again, a huge thank you to all these folks here and more. These are some of the nice folks that support the Metropole Grid on Patreon. We're on Patreon. You can find a link in the description below. Also, shout out to all the Daily Cast patrons for giving me the time to record, edit, do all this sort of stuff to get this stuff together. All the streaming we do, it's an absolute treat. And I'm very lucky to be able to do this as much as I can. And it's all, again, of course, these nice names here. So thank you so much for helping support the channel. And with that note, we'll be in Providence next week at an NPC. It looks like it'll be streamed. Tune in. There should be a link at the bottom once we figure out where that streaming is. I'm not sure what channel it's going to be on yet. It's definitely not going to be this one, so we'll link you to somewhere else. Excited to hear your thoughts on the ban list. And with that, thanks so much for watching.